I remember the exact moment I understood that the world, as I knew it, was finished. I was sitting in my patrol car on the shoulder of Route 9 outside of Millhaven, eating a gas station sandwich and watching the sky do something I had never seen before. It was a Tuesday in late June, just past noon, and the light coming through the windshield had shifted from its usual pale yellow to something deeper, something almost copper, like the sun had swallowed rust. My radio crackled with dispatches that stopped making sense within the hour. A man in Kellerton had collapsed in his driveway with blistering across his forearms and the back of his neck. A school in Drayfield was reporting that 3 children who had been at recess were being rushed to the emergency room with what the principal described as severe sunburn that had appeared in under 4 minutes. By the time I finished my sandwich, the dispatches had stopped altogether, and my sergeant was on the line telling me to get indoors and stay there. He didn't explain why. He didn't have to. I had already stepped out of the car to look at the sky directly and felt it, a faint prickling across my cheekbones, like standing too close to an open oven, except the heat wasn't coming from below. It was coming from everywhere at once. I got back in the car and I drove. I didn't go home. Home was a second-floor apartment with large windows and a balcony facing south, and some instinct I cannot fully explain told me that glass and curtains were not going to be enough. I drove to the Millhaven Transit Authority maintenance tunnels on the east side of the city because I had responded to a call down there 8 months earlier. A homeless man had been living in the access corridor off Junction Street, and I remembered thinking at the time that it was actually not a bad setup. Dry, cool, 2 separate entry points, a long straight corridor with offshoot rooms that the transit workers use for equipment storage. I remembered it the way you remember a place you filed away, without knowing why. Turns out my brain had been preparing for something my conscious mind hadn't caught up to yet. I was not the first one there. A woman named Deena had beat me by about 3 hours. She was an ER nurse at Millhaven General, and she had the same instinct I did, maybe sharper, because she had spent the morning watching people come through her emergency room with burns that had no business appearing that fast on human skin. She had grabbed every medical supply she could carry, loaded it into 2 duffel bags, and walked the 6 blocks from the hospital to the tunnel entrance on Junction Street. When I came down the access stairs with my patrol bag and my service weapon, she looked at me the way people look at someone they were half expecting and said, "We are going to need a lot more people and a lot more food." Over the next 72 hours, we got both. Word spread the way word spreads when civilization is cracking at the seams. In fragments, through fear, carried by people stumbling toward anything that felt like safety. By the end of the first week, there were 41 of us in the tunnels. By the end of the second week, there were 39. The 2 we lost went topside during midday to go back for supplies and didn't come back. We found them the following dawn when a team went looking, both of them just off the Junction Street entrance, maybe half a block from the tunnel door, face down on the pavement. The bleed, as people had started calling the atmospheric deterioration, was not subtle in what it did to you. Extended midday exposure caused rapid oxidative breakdown of skin tissue, hemorrhaging in the lungs, and a particular kind of swelling around the eyes that the doctors on television had been describing in increasingly panicked tones before the broadcast went dark. You didn't feel it happening right away. That was the cruelest part. There was a window of maybe 10 to 15 minutes, depending on your physiology, where you felt nothing unusual, just that faint prickling warmth. And by the time the pain arrived, you were already in serious trouble. Dawn and dusk bought you a longer window, maybe 40 minutes to an hour, when the sun's angle through the grated atmosphere gave you something survivable to work with. We built our entire existence around those windows. Supply runs happen at first light or just before dark. Nobody went alone. Nobody stayed up longer than 30 minutes once the sun crept above the horizon line. Those were Deena's rules, and she enforced them without sentiment. She was not a warm person, but she was a precise one, and in those early months precision was worth more than warmth. I fell into a role that nobody formally assigned me, but that everyone seemed to accept. I was the one who organized the runs, mapped the safe routes through the dead streets above us, kept inventory of what we had and what we needed, and settled disputes when they got loud enough to become dangerous. Ray Coulter helped me with most of it. Ray had been a mechanic with a shop 4 blocks from the tunnel entrance, and he had come down on day 2 with a pickup truck's worth of tools, 2 spare propane tanks, and a calm about him that I have never fully understood given the circumstances. He was the kind of man who made dark jokes at exactly the right moment and meant every one of them. We had been running the tunnels for just over 2 years when Tomas Vega came back alone. He had gone topside at dawn with his sister Carla and a runner named Pete Sully for a supply pushed to the Greenwich hardware store 6 blocks north, a run they had done 4 times before without incident. The window was good that morning, cloud cover cutting the exposure risk down further than usual, and I had cleared the run myself a night before. I was doing inventory in the east storage room when Ray came and got me. He didn't say anything, just put a hand on my shoulder and walked me back toward the main corridor, and I knew from the way he was moving that something had gone wrong. Tomas was on the ground at the base of the access stairs. Deena was already working on him, cutting away his jacket, her face set in that expression she got when she was managing something bad and needed everyone around her to stay out of her way. His skin was intact. He hadn't been out long enough to bleed, but he was shaking in a way that had nothing to do with cold. Owen Pruitt was standing against the far wall with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and Sasha Bloom was sitting on the bottom stair with her knees pulled up, watching Tomas with those quiet, dark eyes she had. I crouched down next to Deena and looked at Tomas, and he turned his head and found my face and grabbed my forearm with both hands hard enough to leave marks. He was trying to say something, and it took him 3 attempts before it came out clearly enough to understand. When it did, the corridor went very still. Carla and Pete were not coming back, and whatever had stopped them from coming back had followed Tomas all the way to our door. Dr. Felix Harmon came shuffling in from a medical bay about 10 minutes after Tomas went down, his glasses pushed up on his forehead the way he wore them when he'd been reading by lamplight, and he took one look at the scene and pulled them down over his eyes and got to work alongside Deena, without being asked. Felix was 63 years old and had been a general practitioner in Millhaven for 30 years before the bleed, and he had the particular exhaustion of a man who had been the only medical resource for 40 frightened people for 2 years running. His supply of almost everything had been critically low for 6 months. He rationed antibiotics like they were made of gold and performed procedures by battery-powered lamp with tools that were never meant for the conditions he was using them in, and he never once complained about any of it in a way that was meant to be heard. I watched him check Tomas's pupils and his pulse and run his hands along his rib cage looking for injury, and I could tell from the way his mouth was set that he was not finding what he was looking for, which meant whatever had happened to Tomas up there had not left marks on his body. It had left marks somewhere else. Owen pushed off the wall and came toward me with that deliberate walk he had, the one that was meant to communicate authority, and stopped close enough that I could smell the recycled air on him and said, "What did he say?" in a tone that meant he had already decided what he was going to do with the answer. I told him. Owen's face did something complicated and then settled back into its usual hard arrangement, and he said, "That's not possible." And I said, "I know." And he said, "Then he's wrong." And I said, "Maybe, but Carla and Pete are still gone, and something put them there, and until I know what that something is, I am treating what Tomas said as fact." Owen didn't like that. He had built the eastern storage for tissue with his own hands and organized a water collection system in the North Corridor, and there was a part of him that had decided those contributions entitled him to say in every decision that got made down here. Most of the time I let him have his say, because a man like Owen was more manageable when he felt heard. But there were moments when the gap between his confidence and the actual situation became dangerous, and this was one of them. I told him we would hold a meeting at 0600, and that nothing was going to be decided before then. and he held my eyes for a moment longer than was comfortable and then nodded once and walked away. Sasha was still on the stairs. She had not moved through any of it, and I sat down next to her, and she said, without looking at me, "How long do you think we have?" I didn't answer her because I didn't have an answer, and she already knew that, and she was not really asking. She was just saying out loud what the rest of us were only thinking. I went back to the storage room and sat in the dark and thought about the route Tomas had taken and what it would mean if something had been living in that space without us knowing. We had been running those streets for 2 years. We knew every doorway and every obstacle and every timing mark. We had never seen anything that suggested the surface was anything other than empty. Dying, yes. Scorched and silent and slowly coming apart at the edges. Yes, but empty. That had been our foundational assumption, and Tomas had just blown a hole straight through it. And now I was sitting in the dark, trying to figure out how much of everything else we thought we knew had just gone with it. Ray found me about an hour later and handed me a cup of something hot that was technically coffee in a way that recycled grain water with a memory of coffee beans is technically coffee, and sat down across from me and said, "You believe him?" It wasn't a question. I said yes. Ray nodded and drank his coffee and was quiet for a moment and then said, "So what do we do?" I told him we were going to find out exactly what came back with Tomas. And then we were going to figure out how to make sure it didn't get in. The meeting at 0600 was the loudest we had ever had in 2 years underground, and that was saying something, because we had some loud ones. 40 people in a tunnel corridor with failing ventilation and collective fear has a way of producing a particular kind of noise that is less about volume and more about pressure. Everything compressed and echoing off concrete walls until the sound itself feels like a physical thing pushing against your chest. Deena stood at the front, and I stood next to her, and we told him what Tomas had said, all of it, without softening any of it. Because in my experience, people who are already scared respond worse to half-truths than they do to the full weight of a bad situation. Tomas had said that they were moving to the dead city 6 blocks north when Carla spotted something in the upper floor window of the Renner building. A shape, human-sized but not moving like anything human. And before either Tomas or Pete could react, it was gone. They kept moving because runners learn quickly that hesitation on the surface costs you time in your window, and time in your window costs you your skin. They reached the hardware store, and Pete went inside while Tomas and Carla held the entrance. That was when it came down from above. Tomas said it dropped from a roof of the building across the street and crossed the open ground between them faster than he could process. He said it hit Pete first, through the storefront glass, and the sound that came was nothing he had heard before and hoped never to hear again. He said Carla ran toward Pete, and he ran after Carla, and then something changed in the air around him. A pressure drop, a shift, like the moment before a car accident when your body knows before your mind does. And he stopped. He said he stopped and Carla didn't, and that was the last time he saw his sister. He ran back to the tunnel entrance without stopping and without looking behind him, and he said the whole way back he could feel something behind him, not close, not rushing, just present, the way a shadow is present. And when he hit the access stairs and came down, he said he knew without being able to explain how he knew that it had stopped at the entrance and not followed him in. That last part was the only thing in his account that felt like good news, and even that came with an asterisk the size of the room. Owen spoke first after I finished, which was predictable. He said Tomas was in shock, and that shock distorts memory and perception, and that we were making catastrophic decisions based on the testimony of a frightened 22-year-old who had just lost a sister. He was not entirely wrong about the shock. He was entirely wrong about what we should do with that information. Deena told him that shock or not, Carla and Pete were gone and something had taken them, and we had exactly 2 options. Treat Tomas's account as reliable and act accordingly, or dismiss it and potentially send more people into the same situation. Owen said the supply runs had to continue regardless, because without them we were dead in 3 weeks, and dismissing the runs over one bad incident was a faster death than whatever Tomas had seen. He had a point. He usually had a point. That was what made him difficult. I let the room talk itself out for about 15 minutes, and then I said we were going to do one thing before any decision was made about future runs, and that thing was a dawn recon of the hardware store route with a 3-person team. Eyes only, no supply retrieval, just information. I said I would lead it myself. Ray volunteered without being asked. Sasha, who knew the surface routes better than anyone alive, said she was going, and I knew better than to argue with her. We went up at first light with the cloud cover still thick enough to stretch our window, and I want to tell you that what we found on those 6 blocks was ambiguous or open to interpretation, but it was not. The first sign was half a block from the tunnel entrance, a set of marks on the pavement that Ray crouched over for a long time without speaking before he stood up and said, "Something heavy, moving fast." The marks were not footprints exactly. They were impressions, deep enough to have cracked the old asphalt in places, spaced in a pattern that suggested something covering ground in long, irregular bounds rather than steps. Sasha followed them with her eyes up the block and said nothing. We moved north and found a second sign 2 blocks up, the remains of what had been a parked delivery van on the east side of the street. The driver's side door peeled back like foil, the roof caved in from above. It was not new damage. The rust patterns around the edges suggested it had happened weeks ago at least, maybe longer. That was when I understood that whatever we were dealing with had been out there for a significant amount of time, and we had simply never known, because we had never been looking for it. We had been watching the sky and watching our windows and watching each other, and we had not once considered that the empty city above us might not be empty. The hardware store was a block and a half further. We didn't make it that far. Sasha stopped us at the corner junction in Greenock with one hand up and pointed to the roof line of the Renner building. The same building Tomas had described, the one where Carla had spotted something in the upper window. There was nothing there when I looked. Then the cloud cover shifted and the light changed, and I saw it, pressed flat against the parapet at the roof's edge, absolutely still, the way a thing is still when it is watching and does not want to be seen watching. It was large. That was the first thing my brain processed, and the most honest thing I can tell you about it, because everything else I registered in that moment was filtered through a fear response that I'm not ashamed to admit was immediate and total. Ray put his hand on my arm, and I put my hand on Sasha's shoulder, and we moved backward one step at a time, without turning around, until we hit the corner, and then we turned and walked fast without running. Because running on the surface triggers something in the hindbrain that makes you want to keep running, and you cannot afford to run out your window. We made it back to the entrance with 12 minutes to spare, and came down the stairs and stood in the corridor, and Sasha leaned against the wall and closed her eyes, and Ray sat down on the bottom step and put his head in his hands, and I stood there with my heart doing things hearts are not designed to do, and try to put together what I was going to say to the 40 people waiting for my report. I had gotten as far as figuring out the first sentence when the motion sensor Ray had rigged at the top of the access stairs, a simple vibration trigger attached to a light on the corridor wall. Clicked on, the light was red. Something was at the entrance. Nobody moved. The light stayed red for 4 seconds and then went dark, and the corridor was very quiet, and then Owen said from somewhere behind me, "It's probably wind," and Ray lifted his head from his hands and looked at Owen with an expression I had never seen on Ray's face before and said, "There is no wind anymore, Owen," and the room went back to being quiet. I told everyone to move to the east corridor and stay there, and I took Ray, and we went back to the base of the access stairs and stood there in the dark and listened. Nothing came down. Nothing made a sound above us. After 10 minutes, I went up the first 4 steps and stopped and listened again and heard nothing, and went up the remaining steps to the access door and pressed my ear against the cold metal and stayed there long enough to be sure, and then came back down. I told Ray it was gone. Ray said, "For now." I said, "Yes, for now," And we looked at each other, and I could see him doing the same math I was doing. The math about the entrance, about the tunnel, about the 40 people behind us, and what one access door between them and something that size actually meant in practical terms. It did not take long to do that math, and the answer was not encouraging. I called another meeting that afternoon, and this time I did not let the room talk itself out. I told them what we had seen on the surface, all of it, and I told them what the motion sensor had registered, and I told them that as of tonight, we were changing the access protocol. The door would be sealed from the inside with the secondary bolt system that Owen's crew had installed 8 months ago and never used because we had always considered it excessive. Owen started to object, and I told him that anyone who wanted to argue about it was welcome to spend the night on the other side of the door, and he went quiet. Deena spent the rest of the day going over Tomas's injuries again with Felix, not looking for new damage, but looking for a pattern. Trying to understand from the way Carla and Pete had been taken whether whatever was out there was hunting opportunistically or deliberately. Felix said the question was above his pay grade, but that the speed Tomas described was not consistent with anything that had existed before the bleed. He said that kind of acceleration in a large organism would require a fundamentally different musculature than anything we had documented, and that the bleed's effect on surface fauna had been studied for about 6 weeks before the research infrastructure collapsed entirely, which meant we were essentially operating without any scientific framework for what the changed atmosphere might have produced in the years since. I asked him what his instinct said, separate from the science, and he looked at me over his glasses for a moment and then said, "My instinct says it is very good at what it does, and that what it does is find things." Ray spent the afternoon reinforcing the door frame with steel brackets from the supply room, and Sasha walked every inch of the tunnel system checking secondary access points, maintenance hatches, ventilation shafts, the old service corridor off the north end that had been partially collapsed since month 3 and that everyone had assumed was impassable. She came back from the service corridor with dirt on her knees and her face, said in a way that made my stomach drop before she even opened her mouth. She said the collapse in the north service corridor was not as complete as we had thought. She said there was a gap at the top of the debris pile, maybe 18 inches wide, that opened into the surface access shaft above. She said it had definitely been an 18-inch gap when the collapse happened 14 months ago, because she had checked it herself. She said it was wider now. I asked her how much wider. She said wide enough. I told Ray. Ray set down his brackets, and we walked to the north service corridor and stood at the base of the debris pile and shone the light up at the gap, and neither of us said anything for a long time. The gap was wide enough. That was all there was to say about it. We spent the rest of that day doing 2 things simultaneously, and both of them felt inadequate given what we were dealing with. The first was reinforcing the north service corridor. Owen's crew stacked everything heavy they could move, equipment crates, steel shelving units, a pair of old rail maintenance carts that had been sitting and used in the west alcove since before we arrived, against the base of the debris pile, and packed the gaps with anything that would fill them. It was not a solution. Owen knew it, and I knew it, and Ray knew it, and the 3 of us stood there looking at the finished result, and none of us said what we were all thinking, because saying it out loud would have done nothing except make the people around us more frightened than they already were. What we were all thinking was that if something large enough and strong enough had been widening that gap from the outside, a stack of equipment crates was going to slow it down for approximately as long as it took to decide it was worth the effort. The second thing we did was hold a vote on sealing the primary entrance. I had not wanted it to be a vote. I had wanted it to be a decision that I made, and that people accepted because the alternative was demonstrably worse. But Deena pulled me aside before the meeting and told me that forcing a unilateral call of that magnitude on a community that had been running on consensus for 2 years was going to fracture something that we could not afford to have fractured, and that Owen was already moving through the corridors talking to people and building a counterposition, and that if I came in with an order instead of a proposal, I was going to hand him exactly the confrontation he was looking for. She was right. She was usually right about the human dynamics, even when I was right about the tactical ones. And the combination of those two things was what had kept 40 people alive and more or less functional for 2 years. So we held the vote. The argument against sealing was Owen's, and he made it well, which I will give him. He stood in front of the community and laid out the supply situation with precision of a man who had been tracking it carefully, and he told them that our current stores gave us between 18 and 23 days depending on rationing levels, and that sealing the primary entrance did not just mean keeping something out, it meant keeping us in, and that dying of starvation in a tunnel was not a meaningfully better outcome than whatever was happening on the surface. He looked at me when he said the last part, and the look was not hostile, exactly, but it was pointed. The argument for sealing was mine, and I made it the only way I knew how, which was directly. I told him that the gap in the North Service corridor existed, and that it had been widened from the outside, and that something that could widen a collapsed debris field from the outside was not something that an unlocked door was going to stop. I told them that sealing bought us time to understand what we were dealing with and to find alternatives, and that running supply operations, while something was actively hunting in our routes, was a faster path to losing more people than Carla and Pete. I did not tell them that I was not sure sealing would be enough. I did not tell them that I had been running numbers in my head, since Sasha showed me the corridor gap, and that the numbers were not coming out in our favor no matter how I arranged them. The vote was 26-14 in favor of sealing. Owen took the result the way Owen took things he disagreed with, in silence, with his jaw set and his eyes doing the actual arguing. I told Ray to seal the door. Ray did it without ceremony, running the secondary bolt home with a sound that echoed the length of the tunnel and left a silence behind it that felt different from the silences we were used to, more final, like a period at the end of a sentence that nobody had wanted to finish. The first night after sealing was the worst night we had experienced underground, and that was a field with significant competition. People who'd been holding themselves together with the logic that the entrance was there if they needed it discovered that the entrance being sealed triggered something in them that was not rational but was absolutely real, a claustrophobic panic that moved through the community in waves, person to person, feeding on itself. Felix spent most of the night moving between people in the grip of it, talking them down, dispensing the last of his anti-anxiety medication in doses so small they were more symbolic than pharmaceutical. Deena told me at around 0200 that we had 3 people who were genuinely destabilized, and that if it got worse, she was not going to be able to manage it with resources she didn't have. I walked the corridors for most of the night, because there was nothing else I could do, and because my presence seemed to help in some marginal way. People saw me moving calmly, and it gave them something to calibrate against. Ray walked with me. We didn't talk much. Around 0300 we passed the North Service corridor, and both of us slowed without discussing it and stood there in the dark outside the barricade and listened. Nothing. Ray said, "Maybe it won't come." I said, "Maybe." He said, "You don't believe that." I said, "No." He said, "Okay," and we kept walking. Sasha found me at 0400 in the East storage room, where I had finally sat down to go over the supply numbers Owen had presented, try and find margin he might have missed or optimism he might have rounded down. She sat across from me and watched me work for a while, and then said she needed to tell me something. I put the numbers down and looked at her, and she said that 3 days before the Vega Sully run, she had been in the North Service corridor running her routine check, and she had heard something. Not movement, not the sound of something widening the gap. Something different. She said it was a sound she did not have a good word for. Rhythmic, low, almost like breathing, but not quite, coming from the other side of the debris pile. She said she had stood there for a long time listening to it, and that it had gone on for several minutes before it stopped. She said she had not told anyone because she had not been certain what she heard, and because she had not wanted to cause alarm over something she could not verify. She said she was telling me now, because she thought I should know that whatever was out there had potentially been aware of the corridor gap before it started widening it. I sat with that for a moment. The implication was not subtle. If it had been listening at the gap before it started working on it, then it had been observing us for longer than we knew. It had been patient. It had been deliberate. That was a different kind of problem than a predator acting on instinct, and it required a different kind of response. And I was still trying to work out what that response looked like when every light in the tunnel went out at once and the darkness came down on us like something solid. And the screaming started from the direction of the north corridor and did not stop. I was on my feet before the echo of the screaming had finished, and moving toward the north corridor before my conscious mind had fully processed the situation. Sasha was right behind me. I got my flashlight on and heard Ray calling my name and other voices rising in the main corridor. Fear compounding on fear the way it does in the dark when nobody can see what is happening. I kept moving. I covered the north service corridor fast and came around the corner with the flashlight up and found Owen Pruitt at the base of the barricade with a pry bar in both hands and his face white as concrete. Behind him, two members of his faction, Jarrus and Tate, both with Owen since month one, were pressed against the wall. Jarrus was the one who had been screaming. He had stopped by the time I got there and was now making a lower sound, a continuous involuntary sound that was somehow worse than the screaming. The barricade was intact. Nothing had come through. I swung the flashlight across the debris pile and up to the gap at the top, and the gap was there, and it was the same size it had been when Sasha measured it, and there was nothing visible in it or through it. I turned to Owen and asked him what he was doing in the corridor with a pry bar at 4 a.m. He said he had been checking the barricade. I said, "Were you checking it or planning to move it?" He said, "I have people who still have family in the city above us, and sealing that door may have been a death sentence for people who are still alive up there." I understood what he was saying more than I wanted to. The difference between Owen and me was that I looked up at that roofline on Junction in Greenock, and the math said that opening the door was not a rescue. It was an invitation. I told him that if he touched the barricade or the primary entrance without community consensus, I would lock him in the supply room, and I held his eyes long enough for him to understand I meant it. He held mine back long enough for me to understand we were not done. Then Ray appeared with 2 battery lanterns, and the corridor got brighter, and Jarrus stopped making a sound, and Tate slid down the wall and sat on the floor. We got the lights back on 20 minutes later. A failed connection in the main battery bank. Not sabotage, just 2 years of improvised wiring finally giving way at the worst possible moment. Ray said he did not believe in cosmic cruelty anymore, because it implied the cosmos was paying attention, and he was no longer confident that was true. I laughed. It felt strange in my chest, like using a muscle I had forgotten I had. By 0600, the community had settled back into its version of normal. People in their spaces, the low murmur conversation, the smell of the morning ration being prepared on the propane burners in the west alcove. I sat with Deena and Felix and Ray and Sasha, and we talked through what we knew and what our actual options were. Felix said Tomas was stable, but not improving. Deena said our supply estimate was probably closer to 16 days now. Morale was affecting rationing discipline, and she could not entirely blame people for it. Ray said the barricade needed proper steel reinforcement, and that it would take 2 days. I told him he would have the help he needed. Sasha said nothing for most of the meeting, and then at the end said she thought we needed to consider the possibility that whatever was out there was not trying getting yet, that it was still deciding. I asked her what she thought it was deciding. She said she thought it was deciding whether we were worth the effort. Nobody had a response to that. We dispersed to our tasks, and I went back to the supply numbers and did not find the margin I was looking for, and sat in the quiet of the storage room and thought about what Sasha had said and wondered what conclusion something patient and deliberate and adapted to the lethal sky above us would eventually reach about 40 frightened people in a tunnel. I did not like where the thinking went. The darkness after the lights went out the second time was different from the first. The first time had been an accident. Bad wiring, bad timing. The mundane failure of improvised infrastructure. The second time the lights went out, they did not flicker. They did not fade. Every battery lantern, every rig fluorescent strip, every handheld torch that had been left on in the corridor went dark in the same instant, simultaneously, as if something had reached into the tunnel system and closed a fist around every source of light at once. That is not how electrical systems fail. I knew that, and Ray knew that, and the silence that followed the darkness told me that enough other people knew it too. For about 3 seconds, nobody made a sound, and then everything happened at once. I had my personal flashlight on my belt, and I had it on within the first second, and I was already moving and calling for Ray by name and telling everyone else to stay where they were and not move, which was optimistic instruction given the circumstances, but something to say into the dark is better than nothing. Ray answered from my left, and I swung the beam toward his voice and found him, and he already had his own light out, and we stood back to back in the main corridor and swept our beams in opposite directions, and what we saw was people frozen in place along the walls, faces pale in the flashlight wash, eyes wide, and for a moment it looked almost organized, almost calm. Then something moved at the far end of the north corridor. Not a person. The way it moved was not a person. I had my beam on it for less than a second before it pulled back into the dark beyond the reach of my light, and in that less than a second I registered. Large, low to the ground in a way that suggested it was choosing to be low, and fast in a particular way that things are fast when speed is not an effort but a default. I did not say anything about what I had seen. I told Ray quietly to start moving people toward the east storage room, and I took point at the corridor entrance and kept my light on the far end and listened. Sasha peered at my shoulder from somewhere and did not ask what I had seen and did not need to. She had her own small light, and she angled it at the ceiling to diffuse the beam and give us a wider field, and I could have kissed her for the presence of mind. We got most of the community into the east storage room in under 4 minutes. Most. Owen's faction had been in the west alcove when the lights went, and by the time Ray got there with his light, the alcove was empty. 3 people, Owen, Jarrus, and a quiet man named Doss who had been with Owen's group since the early weeks, were not with the others. Ray came back and told me, and I stood at the storage room door and made the calculation that I hated making and told him to get inside and bar the door and that I was going to find them. Ray said he was coming with me. I told him I needed him inside with the others. He told me that Deena was inside with the others and that she was more equipped to manage 40 frightened people in a small room than he was, and that I was not walking the dark tunnel alone, and that was the end of the discussion. It was the end of the discussion. We moved west with our lights low, sweeping the corridor ahead in short arcs, stepping carefully, not talking. The tunnel had a smell it did not usually have, something damp and mineral and faintly organic, the way soil smells when it's been freshly turned. I noticed it and filed it without comment and kept moving. We found Jarrus first. He was in a connecting passage between the west alcove and the north service corridor, sitting against the wall with his knees up and his arms wrapped around them and his eyes open and fixed on the middle distance. He was breathing. He was not injured that I could see. He was not responsive in any meaningful way. I said his name twice and touched his shoulder, and he did not react, did not blink, did not shift his gaze. Ray checked his pulse and looked at me and nodded once to confirm he was alive, and I made the decision to leave him for the moment and keep moving because Jarrus sitting in a daze was survivable, and whatever else was in this tunnel might not allow us the luxury of stopping. We found Doss 4 meters further on. I am not going to describe in detail what we found because some things are not made better by detail, and this is one of them. I will say that Doss had been a quiet man who kept himself and did small useful things without being asked, and that he deserved better than what the tunnel gave him in the dark. Ray made a sound that was not quite a word and turned away, and I put my hand on his back for a moment, and then we kept moving, because stopping was not an option. Owen we did not find. We covered the west alcove and the north service corridor and the connecting passages, and every storage room along the west wall, and Owen Pruitt was not in any of them. The barricade in the North Service corridor was intact. The primary entrance bolt was still thrown. There was no sign of forced entry from either point, and no sign that Owen had attempted to open either. He was simply gone. The same way you are gone when something that is very good at what it does decides it is done deciding. I thought about what Sasha had said, that it was still deciding whether we were worth effort. And I thought about the fact that it had come inside and taken one person and left, and I tried to understand the logic of that, and could not, which was the most frightening part. A thing that kills for survival is comprehensible. A thing that kills selectively, that enters and exits without triggering either barricade, that leaves one person sitting in a daze and takes another and leaves a third in a condition I am not going to describe. That is something else. That requires a different category of fear. We went back for Jarrus and carried it between us to the east storage room, and Ray knocked on the door in the pattern we had agreed on, and Deena let us in, and the room was hot and close with 40 people in it, and smelled of sweat and fear. And when the door closed behind us and the bar went down, I felt something that I recognized after a moment as relief, which under circumstances was almost funny. Almost. Felix took Jarrus and got him into a corner and started working on him. And Deena pulled me aside and asked what we had found, and I told her quietly and watched her face do what her face did when she was receiving information that required immediate processing and careful management, and she nodded once and said, "How long do we have in here before the air becomes a problem?" I said 8 hours, maybe 10 if people stayed calm and breath slow. She said, "They are not going to stay calm." I said, "I know." She said, "So what do we do?" I said I was going to wait 2 hours, and then I was going to go back out there, and I was going to find out how it was getting in and out without triggering either barricade, because until I knew that the storage room door was the only thing between 40 people and whatever had just taken Owen Pruitt, and I wanted to know exactly how much that door was worth. Deena looked at me for a long moment, and then said, "Take Sasha." I said Sasha was not going back out there. Sasha, from across the room, said yes, she was. The 2 hours passed the way they pass when you are in a sealed room with 40 people and no certainty about what is on the other side of the door. Felix got Jarrus responsive enough to speak within the first 30 minutes. Responsive being a relative term, because what Jarrus said was not reassuring. He said he had been in the west alcove when the lights went and that he had heard Owen say something was moving in the passage, and then there was a sound, and then there was nothing, and he had pressed himself against the wall and closed his eyes and stayed that way. He said he had heard it pass within a meter of him in the dark. He said it had stopped. He said he could feel it stopped, the way you feel a presence in a room even when you cannot see it, and it had been there for what felt like a very long time, and then it had not been there anymore. I asked if he had seen anything. He said he had kept his eyes closed. I asked if he had heard anything while it was stopped near him. He said yes. He said it breathed, slow and deliberate, like something not exerting itself, each exhale carrying the same brief low note at the end, over and over until it left. I looked at Sasha, and she looked back at me, and we were both thinking about what she had heard in the North Service corridor 3 days ago, the rhythmic sound she had not had a word for. We were both understanding that it had been inside the tunnels before it ever came through the gap, that the gap may not have been a point of entry at all. Sasha and I went out at the 2-hour mark with Ray running the door behind us, moving with lights low through the tunnel. The smell still present, stronger now, or maybe I was more attuned to it. The barricade in the north corridor was undisturbed. Sasha climbed the debris pile and shone her light through the gap and said the shaft looked clear. I asked what she had expected. She said she had expected it to look clear. We moved through every section of the tunnel methodically, and Sasha ran her hand along the walls in several places in a way that seemed specific, and I let her work without asking, because her relationship with the tunnel system operated on a frequency I did not have access to. In the east maintenance room, she stopped at the back wall, held her light flat against the concrete, traced something with her fingers, and called me over. There was a seam in the wall that should not have been there. Not a crack. The concrete on either side was intact, no stress fractures, no age damage. A seam, clean edge, running floor to ceiling in a vertical line, and then along the floor in both directions. Sasha pressed on the wall, and it did not move, but the sound it made was wrong, hollow where the surrounding concrete was solid. I stood there looking at it for a long moment, and then I looked at Sasha, and she looked at me and said, "It did not come through the gap. It came through here, and it has been doing it long enough that the edges are worn smooth." I put my hand on the seam and felt the smoothness she meant. Not the rough edge of new damage, but the rounded, worn quality of something that has been used repeatedly over a long period of time. Long enough that we had never thought to look for it, because we had been here 2 years, and it had been using this passage for at least as long, and we had never known, had never heard it, never smelled it, never caught a single sign, until it decided to let us. Standing in the east maintenance room with my hand on that worn seam, I watched everything I thought I knew reorganize itself into something I liked considerably less. We had been operating on the assumption that the tunnel was ours, found it, claimed it, built a life in it. That assumption had been wrong from the beginning. Whatever had been using that passage had done. So while we rationed food 3 rooms away and held meetings and believed ourselves to be the most dangerous things in our own home, the seam was not new. The wear was not new. We had been sharing this tunnel for 2 years with something that had chosen not to make itself known until now. That choice, its deliberateness, was what kept circling back as Sasha and I made our way to the storage room, and I looked at 38 faces waiting for what I was about to say. I told them about the seam plainly, the way I had learned to deliver bad information. The room received it in silence and then in controlled noise of people each processing something terrible. Felix sat still with his hands in his lap. Deena asked 3 precise questions and filed the answers. Tate said from her corner, "So it has always been able to get to us." And I said yes, and she said, "Then why are we still alive?" And I said that was a question I intended to answer. I want to be honest about my state of mind because this account is not useful if I am not. I was afraid in a way that had a different quality than the fear of the first weeks underground. That fear had been large and diffuse. This fear was specific and close with a texture I felt in my hands and the base of my throat. I had seen it twice for less than a second each time, and in both cases what my nervous system registered before my conscious mind caught up was not its shape or size, but the quality of its attention. It had been watching us for a long time, and I was going to have to go to the surface to understand why, and I had known that since we found the seam and had been circling it the way you circle something you have already decided to do. I told Deena I was going up at the next dawn window. She said, "What are you expecting to find?" I said I did not know. She said, "Cole." I said the supply situation meant we could not stay sealed indefinitely, and going up was not a choice. It was the only remaining option, and if she could find me another, I would take it. She could not. Nobody could. Ray spent the hours before dawn checking my equipment with the thoroughness of a man who was not coming with me and knew it, and was putting everything he had into the preparation, because it was the only contribution available to him. He checked my flashlight batteries and my surface suit, the improvised layered outfit we had developed in month 3 to extend topside window time, and my timer and my water, and he did not make any dark jokes, which told me more about how he felt than anything he could have said. Sasha told me she was coming, and I told her she was not, and she told me that she knew the surface routes and the timing marks and the safe shelter points better than anyone alive, including me, and that her coming improved my odds of returning, and that improving my odds of returning improved the odds of the 38 people in the storage room, and that I could not argue with that math. And she was correct. I could not argue with it. We went up together at first light. The surface hit me the way it always did. A physical shock of space after the compressed closeness of the tunnel. The sky enormous and colorless in the early light. The dead city spread out in every direction in its particular post-bleed stillness. No wind. No birds. No sound of engines or voices, or anything that had been human and ongoing. Just the vast quiet of a world that had stopped. The prickling warmth was already present on my exposed skin, even at this hour, and I checked my timer, and we moved. I had a route in mind that would take us toward the origin point of whatever had been coming into our tunnel. Not the Renner building where we had seen on the roofline, but further in the direction that the impressions in the pavement had been trending when Ray and I had followed them on the recon. Northwest, toward the old industrial district, where the city's bones were larger and the buildings were built to last, and the underground infrastructure was deep and extensive. Sasha moved beside me without needing direction, reading the streets the way she always had. Her eyes going to high points, the sight lines, the places where something large could be and not be seen. We were 4 blocks from the tunnel entrance when she put her hand on my arm, and we stopped. Across the street, in the recessed loading bay of a warehouse distribution center, there was a structure that had not been there before the bleed. I had driven past this building on patrol, and the loading bay had been empty concrete. What was in it now had been built from materials I recognized: vehicle panels, metal shelving, chain-link fencing, concrete blocks, arranged with a precision that made my chest go cold. It was not a nest. A nest is built from instinct without architecture. What was in the loading bay had architecture, an interior and exterior, and a deliberate orientation. Facing southeast, toward our tunnel entrance 4 blocks away, Sasha said, very quietly, beside me, "It knows exactly where we are." I said, "Yes." She said, "It has always known." I said, "Yes." She said, "Cole, look at the top." I looked at the top of the structure, and it took me a moment to understand what I was seeing. And then it took me another moment to accept what I had understood. Lining the upper edge of the structure, arranged with regularity that could not be accidental, were objects I recognized. A water canteen with our community's mark scratched into the side. A section of the orange safety netting we used to mark the hazardous floor section in the north corridor. A boot that I recognized because I had watched Ray repair its sole 3 months ago, and it had belonged to a runner named Sully, who had not come back from the same run that had taken Carla. It had been watching us, and it had been collecting us, and it had built something from what it had collected, and it had oriented that something toward our home, and I stood on the dead street in the early light, with the prickling warmth already building on my skin, and the timer running down, and I tried to find a framework for what I was looking at, and could not, and looked at Sasha, and she looked back at me, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked exactly as frightened as the situation warranted. Then something moved inside the structure, something large, and it was awake. We did not run. Running changes the nature of certain interactions in ways you cannot take back. We walked, fast, measured, back the way we had come, and I kept my eyes forward and counted my steps and heard nothing behind us. The absence of sound from something that size was itself information. It knew where we were going and did not need to rush. That understanding settled into me like cold water, and I kept walking. We made the tunnel entrance with 8 minutes on our window, and I descended those stairs with Sasha behind me, and Ray was at the bottom, and he looked at our faces and moved the door, and I heard him check the bolt twice after it was already thrown. I went straight to Deena and Felix and told them what we had found: the structure, the objects on its upper edge, the orientation, what those things together implied. Felix's expression moved through several stages before arriving at genuine scientific alarm beneath the fear. He said, "It is not an animal." I said, "No." He said, "Then what is it?" I said I did not know what category it belonged anymore. The bleed had been changing surface fauna for 5 years with no one studying it, and whatever this thing had been before, it was not that anymore. Felix said it built something. I said, "Yes." He said, "It collected objects associated with us and built something and oriented it toward us." I said, "Yes." He sat with that for a long moment, and then he said, "That is not predation. That is something else." I said I knew. Deena said, "Does it change what we have to do?" I said it changed how we had to think about what we had to do, which amounted to the same thing. She said, which is what? I looked at Deena and Felix and Ray and the 36 others trying not to listen, and said the thing I had been turning over since I stood on that dead street. I said we had been thinking about this as a survival situation. I was no longer certain that was the correct frame. I said I thought we needed to consider the possibility that whatever was in that loading bay was not hunting us, that it had observed us for 2 years, taken 3 people in a sequence that suggested selection, collected objects from our lives with a care that implied meaning, and built something facing our home that was not a trap and not a warning. I said, I thought it might be trying to tell us something. The room was very quiet. Deena looked at me for a long time and then said, or it is something so different from us that what looks like communication to you is something we do not have a word for. I said, yes. I said that was also possible, and that was why I needed to go back out there. Not at dawn, not with a window and a timer, and the pressure of the bleed counting down on my skin. I needed more time on the surface than a window allowed, and there was only one way to get it, and everyone in the room knew what that way was, and nobody said it out loud, and I let the silence sit there until Sasha said it for me. She said the suits won't hold past 40 minutes. I said I know. She said the University Research Station on Caldwell Street had atmospheric gear in the basement lab. She had seen it on a run 14 months ago and left it because we had not needed it then. 6 blocks east. I looked at Ray. He said he could have 2 people ready in an hour. I said no. I said I was going alone and held up my hand before Ray could argue, and said that if it wanted to stop me reaching Caldwell Street, it would do so regardless of how many people I brought, and that sending more people into that was a number I was not willing to run. Ray nodded once, slowly, the way he nodded when he had decided to accept something he disagreed with, and that nod cost him something. I would go at the next dawn, alone, get to Caldwell Street, find the gear, and go back to the loading bay. Find out what was in there and what it wanted, or I would not come back. Both outcomes would tell the others something useful. I did not say that last part out loud. I went out alone at first light with the atmospheric gear, and putting on felt like armor, a feeling that lasted until I stepped onto the dead street, and the city opened up in its enormous silence, and I understood that whatever confidence the gear gave me was the confidence of a man wearing a raincoat in the ocean. The gear extended my window to something closer to 3 hours, and 3 hours on the surface was more time than I had ever had. With 40 minutes, you are always counting. With 3 hours, I could stop. I could look, and what I found on the first block was not entirely dead. A thin line of actual living green pushing up through a crack in the pavement, small and tentative and incongruous. I saw 3 more like it on the way to Caldwell. Small, persistent things finding accommodation with the changed sky that the larger plants had not managed. I filed that and kept moving. The research station was where Sasha said it would be, and the basement lab was unlocked, which told me someone had been in and out since the bleed began. The atmospheric gear was in a back cabinet. For suits, 2 in good condition. Filter cartridges, a sealed equipment case I did not have time to inventory. I took what I could carry and stood for a moment looking at papers still on desks and a coffee mug still on the window ledge and a whiteboard full of atmospheric particulate notations, and felt the grief of a world interrupted. And then went back out because grief is a luxury a 3-hour window does not fully accommodate. The loading bay was 4 blocks from Caldwell, and I approached from the north with cover from the building line. In full morning light, the structure was even more deliberate than it had appeared at dawn. The objects on the upper edge were more numerous than I had registered. Not just a canteen and boot, but smaller things belonging to specific people. Sasha's red cord, a lens from Felix's glasses, the cover of the supply ledger I had kept for 2 years. I stood at the corner and felt something shift in my understanding that I do not have a precise word for. Not fear, but something adjacent to awe. The feeling of encountering evidence of a mind that has been working on a problem for a very long time. I stepped out and walked toward the loading bay and did not stop walking. I did not approach slowly or with my hand near anything that could be used as a weapon. I walked toward it the way you walk toward something you have decided to meet, and stopped at the entrance and waited. Nothing moved inside for a long moment. Then everything moved at once, and every instinct I had screamed at me to run. And I did not run because I had made a decision, and the decision was the only thing I had left to stand on. It was larger than I had processed from the roofline and the corridor. That was the first thing. The second thing was that it was not the shape I had been constructing in my imagination from the fragments I had seen, not low and animal in the way I had half expected, but upright, mostly, in a way that had something almost architectural about it, the way very old trees are architectural. It moved to the entrance of the structure and stopped, and we looked at each other across maybe 3 meters of dead street, and the morning light came down between us, and I could hear my own breathing inside the respirator and nothing else. It did not make a sound. I did not make a sound. We stayed that way for what I think was about 2 minutes, but which felt like a unit of time for which I do not have a better name. Then it stepped back once and turned and went into the interior of the structure, and I understood, with a certainty I cannot fully explain and will not try to, that I was being invited to follow. I followed. The interior was larger than the exterior suggested, and when my eyes adjusted, I stood very still and looked at what was around me. The walls were covered, not randomly but systematically, densely, in a way that had taken a very long time. Marks arranged in patterns that repeated and varied and repeated again. Not language as I understood it, but not language either. Something with syntax and recurrence and a hierarchy of symbols. Interspersed throughout were images, representational. The tunnel entrance on Junction Street. Our surface routes, rendered with an accuracy that suggested long observation. Figures that I understood after a moment to be us, our community, our people. And in the center of the back wall, larger than everything else, was a map, not of the city above, but of what was below it. The full underground infrastructure extending far beyond the section we had been living in. Marked on that map were locations, many of them concentrated in the deep northwest in a way that suggested not just knowledge but habitation. A network of spaces occupied by something that had been underground far longer than us. I stood in front of that map for a long time. It stood behind me and did not move, and I did not turn around because I was not ready, and it seemed to understand that. I thought about the green things in the pavement cracks, about the bleed changing everything it touched with no one left to study it, about 37 people running out of food and options, about what a map of that size meant about what was down there, and what knowing it could mean for the people I had come from. Then I turned around. It was closer than I expected, and I managed not to step back, which I am still quietly proud of. We were face to face in the dim interior, and I understood in that moment what I had been building toward since Tomas came down the stairs alone, that had not taken Owen and Dawson, Carla and Pete, because it was a predator acting on instinct. It had taken them because it was trying to initiate something, and it spent 2 years building a framework to do it. And the structure around me was that framework, and I was standing inside it. I raised my hand, palm out, no weapon, the most basic signal in the human repertoire. It watched my hand, and then raised one of its own limbs in a movement that was not the same but occupied the same communicative space. And we stood there in something built over years out of patience and a desire to cross a distance that neither of us had a map for. Until now, I went back to the tunnel at a walk, not a run. For blocks out, I stopped and looked back at the loading bay, and nothing was emerging, and I stood there and thought about Ray's Nod and Felix's glasses on the wall, and Owen who was gone, and the green things in the pavement cracks, and 37 people running out of time. And I made a decision. I went back to loading bay and walked directly to the back wall and put my hand on the map and traced the northwest section and turned. It was watching my hand. I pointed to the map. I pointed northwest. I pointed back toward the tunnel, toward the people. It was still long enough that I thought I had misread everything. Then it moved to the back wall and added a line, connecting the northwest section to a location I recognized immediately as the east maintenance room of our tunnel, the passage behind the seam. Not an intrusion point, a connection. I went back down at a controlled walk, and Ray was at the bottom of the stairs with the look of a man who had been waiting with everything he had for the sound of my footsteps. He said, "You're alive." I said yes. He went to gather everyone, and I stood at the base of the stairs and listened to 37 people moving into the corridor, the shuffle and murmur of a community that had earned a rest and not gotten one, and was still here anyway. I told them everything. The structure, the walls, the map, the line. I told them that whatever the bleed had produced had been watching us for 2 years without hurting us when it could have at any point, and had built an architecture of communication to tell us something I believed was an offer, without certainty, without proof, with only the map and the raised limb and the line drawn with intent. I told them it was not safe, and I could be wrong about all of it, and it was also the best option we had seen in 2 years. Deena said, "When do we go?" And that was that. We spent 2 days preparing. Felix packed his medical kit with the care of a man who understood each item might be the last of its kind. Sasha walked the tunnel one final time and came back and said goodbye to it in her quiet way that did not require words. Ray left the passage open. On the third morning, I went back to the loading bay alone. And it came to the entrance, and we looked at each other, and I turned and pointed back toward the tunnel. And it came with me through the dead streets and down the stairs. 37 people pressed against the corridor walls and watched it come down, and the silence was the most complete I have ever heard from that many people. It moved through them to the east maintenance room and through the passage, and Ray looked at me and shrugged one shoulder the way he shrugged at things beyond comment, and Deena gave me 3 precise nods, and Sasha was already walking, and the 34 others behind me did not turn back. We went into the dark. The passage behind the seam was narrow at first, and then it was not, opening into a corridor that was older than the tunnel we had come from and larger and dry and ran northwest in a straight line that felt like intention. We followed it for about 10 minutes before it opened into something I did not have an adequate word for, a space underground, large enough that my flashlight did not reach the far wall, with a ceiling high enough that I could not see it, and an evidence of habitation that was not new and not ours, not hostile either, just present, just there, just waiting to be understood. We are still here, 3 weeks in, and the space is larger than we have mapped, and the food situation is manageable in ways it was not before. Felix found something growing in the deep northwest chambers that he has been studying with an excitement I have not seen on his face since before the bleed. Sasha started learning the walls, the marks, the patterns, something that is not language yet but is moving toward it, or maybe we are moving toward it, meeting in the middle. I do not fully understand what we are sharing this space with, or what it was before the bleed, or what it wants from us in the long run. I am not sure those are the right questions anymore. The sky is still lethal. Owen is still gone, and so are Dawson, Carla, and Pete, and I carry them the way you carry people who did not reach the place you eventually found. But we are not sealed in a room running out of air. We are underground, deeper than before in the dark, which is where we've been all along. The difference is we are not alone in it anymore. I think that means everything.